Muy bien, buenos días, bienvenidos a las vacaciones. Aunque este evento lo hacemos en inglés, pero voy a empezar dándoos la bienvenida aquí en septiembre, que os veo a todos muy morenos y muy dispuestos ya de nuevo a este año muy interesante para el mundo energético, con todas estas iniciativas del gobierno, con la ley, con todas estas cosas. Tenemos allí a Eduardo, ¿no?, que no lo había visto, de cambio climático, etcétera. Yo creo que tenemos un curso interesante y vamos a empezarlo con estas presentaciones de la agenda, ¿no? I'm going to switch to English because I have here Juho Lipponen y Luis Munuera. As you can see, Luis Munuera es español. They are going to make this presentation together. But as you know, this energy technology perspective, this is the second time we are presenting here. Last year we presented this report. This is our report from the agency. We have a very good relationship with many official and the body itself. And well, this is a good idea for starting this new season. No? I think so, because they are analyzing all the situation of the technologies. We are ready. We're going well to these 2 degrees goal, and what are going to need more support to develop in the near future. And in the club, we always think that the technology could be the best solution for getting these goals, and this is why we are encouraging them to present all of this, and every year we are doing that. Well, I'll try to introduce both of them with their CV. Juho Lipponen, I'm going to pronounce well. He was working before in the Euroelectric. That's why many people from UNESA knew him. And he joined the International Energy Agency 6 years ago. 2010, seven years ago. He worked before in the field of CCS a lot. Now he's responsible for CCS, and now he is the acting head of the ATP division of the sustainability in the energy in the international energy. He holds a degree for Finnish. He's Finnish, and together we have Luis Munuera. Como veis, es español. Luis es aquí de Madrid. He's working in the IEA since 2012 or something like this. He's working in this area of sustainability, technology and outlook of the IEA. He coordinates all the smart systems. I knew him talking about these smart systems. No? This is your field of responsibility. He's a master's degree here in La Autónoma. No? This is really, well, they are going to make together this presentation, and the floor is yours. Maybe you will start. Okay. Here you are.
Is that a better one to use? Okay. Great. Are we audible to everybody at the back, hopefully? Mr. Gutierrez, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and to the club for the invitation to the IEA to come and present ETP to you today. I don't know what the weather was like in Brussels, where Luis was yesterday, but it was terrible and rainy and horrible in Paris all day yesterday, so it's great to be here in Madrid, where the sun shines and it's nice and warm, which is a great start. And then, of course, very nice to be presenting to the club on ETP. We're going to do a joint show with Luis, and I think at the end there will also be an opportunity to ask questions in Spanish as well. And Luis will take all the questions in Spanish, and if people have questions in English, then I can take them.
Okay.
Okay. And we got a number of slides, and we'll kind of switch one speaker to another throughout this presentation. We've divided this into kind of 3 themes or parts. Very quick introduction of some key trends and some key news from the agency. Secondly, a little introduction to the ETP energy modeling philosophy and how that gets done and what's important in it. And then thirdly, the ETP 2017 book, the key results of this, and we will also have a book to leave to the club after this. And after the meeting, there's also going to be Spanish language executive summaries available outside. So, the IEA, for those of you who do not know us, we are a government organization initially founded by 17 OECD countries to fight energy security problems in the wake of the early 70s oil crisis. And so that was the start, but the realm of IEA work has obviously grown from energy security to many other areas in sustainable development, energy markets and so forth. And I think what our unique selling point is really the data and energy analysis that we do to back what we hope then to be good energy policy decisions and governance by governments, but also increasingly by industry. And I think industry is more and more involved with the IEA. We have the CEO level Energy Business Council that involves lots of the main large energy players in the world across the board, not just fossil fuels, but also technology, renewables, you name it. And they come together also to inform IEA work. And at the moment, if you look at what's in a way going on, we've got what our executive director Fatih Birol talks of, labels modernization program, and you can always debate how much is modernization and how much is just shifting to respond to challenges in the outside world. But there's three key points in this. The first is the opening of the doors. The IEA has been an OECD group until now, but little by little we're really bringing the large emerging economies, China, India, Indonesia, various others, into the IEA family through some new membership structures. We're also secondly looking to work even more widely on energy security, not just looking at oil, but extending that to gas security, electricity security. And the third big point that Fatih Birol is very keen to stress and develop us towards is for us to be a global hub for clean energy technology and energy efficiency, and that we do by heightened activity in energy efficiency, in energy technology analysis, boosting our energy technology network. We'll say a few more words about that later on, and so forth. So not just the same old stuff. I think we've got lots of interesting new things coming up at the IEA. You will see in the map and in the pack afterwards, the green countries are the main members, and perhaps to note are the two red ones from Latin America, Chile and Mexico, that are becoming IEA members. Mexico actually this year. Their process should be finalized by the IEA ministerial that happens in November, and Chile a bit afterwards. I'm not sure if you see it that well, but the countries here that are marked with the stripes, these are the association members, and it's actually a really nice development that we've had in the past couple of years to bring China, India, Indonesia, Thailand. Then we have Singapore here, but you cannot really see the stripings, and Morocco. So 6 emerging economies are association members now of the IEA, and they're coming more and more actively to the club. So then more towards the topic of the day, some of the key trends and perhaps starting points that orient the ETP 2017 book. The first is the recognition that due to various drivers that we have, be it economic, energy security or sustainability, there is a lot of change happening in the energy markets and the sector as we speak. Renewables supplied half of the electricity growth in 2016, which is unprecedented. That renewables growth is very much a point to be stressed, and we hope that continues. Electric car sales were up 40% in 2016, and we passed the threshold of 2 million electric cars globally. Obviously, that's still a very small base, but that growth has been rapid, and we'll come to a few more details on that. But there are technological shifts happening in the world as we speak. It also has to be recognized that the energy sector has a lot of issues and challenges to it. It remains a key aspect of our sustainable economic growth going forward. We still have over 1 billion people without access to electricity, nearly 3 million people without daily access to clean cooking. It is the largest sector responsible for greenhouse gas emissions today, roughly 2/3, and also air pollution issues. Some 6.5 million premature deaths are attributed according to the World Health Organization, to energy transformation. So local air pollution issues are also becoming rapidly a key driver for change. And perhaps another starting point here is that in ETP or in any of our analysis, we're not trying to tell one single story of what the future of global energy transformation is going to be like. It will be different in different regions and countries, and that's something to be kept in mind. And one shouldn't think that the IEA is somehow telling the world how exactly to transform energy, because that will happen in different ways in different countries. From the past few years, we also have a few rather promising signs. One is on CO2 emissions. They seem to have remained flat for the past 3 years, from 2014 onwards. Whether that's a trend that will continue, we're not sure. Actually, we expect that it might not. But certainly it shows that policies and transformation has had an impact in curbing energy-related CO2 emissions in the past couple of years. Don't know if you could see this as just a little bit of detail on that explains those figures. The fact that both US and China have actually cut their CO2 emissions in the past years, as well as Japan, explains a lot of that flattening of the curve globally. Then you have other emerging economies like India, where this reduction obviously has not taken place, but they're starting from a very different base. This has been due to fuel switching, from coal to gas in many regions. Obviously, the growth in renewables, energy efficiency improvements, and also nuclear actually has grown in the past years. 2016 was a record year in nuclear capacity addition. So a lot of things have contributed to this. Whether this will continue, is yet to be seen, but that's certainly a helpful sign. What we do in this space on energy technology, I think in our division and the agency as a whole, trying to answer a number of questions. One is in a way the where do we need to go, and that's typically the technology perspective scenario work, looking at what a suitable or an ambitious sustainable outcome ought to be 2050, 2060 and forward. And we'll talk about that in a moment. A second area is also trying to answer the question that where we are today. And that's actually the first part of ETP. When you look at the book, you will see that the first part of it is the Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report, which we have published for a number of years in a row, that tracks what the progress year on year is on a suite of technologies. And that's to establish baseline to know where we are currently today. We'll say a few words about that as well. We're moving, but nowhere fast enough. And then a third area that is very relevant and large in our division's analysis is the how do we get there? How do different technologies, how can we make them move forward? What are the roadmaps? And we have a series of over 20 energy technology roadmaps available now, all downloadable for free on the IEA site, and a few more coming up. Maybe Luis will touch upon smart grids that he's working on at the moment, and we have another new energy technology roadmap on bioenergy coming up shortly as well. So where do we need to go? Where are we today? And how do we get to a desired outcome? All these points we deal with in our work and touch upon in today's talk. And we have an energy technology network that groups thousands of folks from over 50 countries to study, analyze various energy technologies. Going back to that question, where are we today? I think a key headline from this year's Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report is that potential of clean energy technology remains underutilized. Tracking these various technologies to the 2DS scenario, we'll come back to the scenarios as well, but 2DS being that climate-friendly central scenario that we've developed, we grouped technologies under essentially three groups. Those that are definitely not on track. Here you have areas such as more efficient coal-fired power. Last year, 1/3 of new installed coal-fired capacity was still subcritical, technology that shouldn't really be deployed anymore. So efficiency improvements are not happening anywhere near fast enough. Same thing, obviously, with carbon capture and storage, that we would need to be deployed much faster than we see today. There is a middle group of technologies, various renewables, nuclear, transport, and the fuel economy aspect of it in particular, that are making inroads and headway forward. In lighting and appliances, for example, we've got over 1/3 of all appliances in the world now that are governed by efficiency standards. That figure should be much higher, but it has grown from a very small base to 1/3 now, and hopefully that number increases. So we have a number of areas where progress is made, but acceleration is needed. And there's actually a section on each of these in the Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report in ETP. So if there's an area of interest for yourselves, do go and have a look and see the details. And then we have, luckily, some areas where progress seems to be on track. Solar PV and onshore wind are two renewable energy areas where progress remains very good, and we could be on track if progress continues as we have seen it today to deliver on these technologies. Energy storage, we'll also touch upon a little bit later on, has made good progress in the past few years, and electric vehicles that were also mentioned, over 2 million vehicles on the roads today, and hopefully that continues as well. But by and large, even if there are some good signs, some helpful signs, and a few technologies in the green, they alone are not enough to drive the whole energy sector to be on track. Can't remember. Was I supposed to do this, Luis, or you?
I think you, but I can.
It's fine. I start and you can contradict me when you feel that I'm not going in the right direction. Well, this is pretty self-explanatory. Here we see evolution of the global EV fleet in the past years, and see that we have reached indeed that 2 million vehicle threshold last year. It is currently actually a game of a very few countries. China stepped up significantly, United States, and then smaller countries like Japan, well, small, but for example Norway, where incentives for purchasing electric vehicles have been at a very high level. But the development is good, but limited to perhaps too small number of countries at the moment. What can also be observed is the rate of growth. It is natural that you start from a very high growth rate and that growth rate declines and sort of levels off a little bit. But we need to watch this. The sales growth was 40%. I think we were over 50% of the stock growth. But those growth figures are important, and in order for that development to continue, those growth figures led by policy incentives need to be kept in place in order for the EVs to continue to deliver. Looking at PV and onshore wind, they have also experienced a very steady, good growth over the past decade or so. And if we contrast that with where we ought to be in our 2DS scenario by 2025, we just about work out that these technologies are as well on track to deliver. But again, pace needs to continue, and we cannot take the foot off the gas pedal on these technologies either. And going back to that earlier point on too few technologies being in the green, sort of illustrated on this slide. If we look at low carbon power or renewable power technologies, the fact that solar PV and onshore wind are on track, they are not alone able to draw the whole renewable electricity palette or portfolio to be on track. So that's we need progress on lots of the other renewable electricity areas going forward. Well, that shows the targets that we have in the 2DS scenario for renewable-based electricity by 2025. We should be over 35% at that point, and our analysis suggests that we're not going to reach that. Then we move to a much more analytical and interesting part on energy modeling, which is going to be given by Luis, who knows all about that. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juho. Thank you very much. Like that? Yeah, so we good. By the way, I should point out I really am Spanish. I'm sorry I'm giving this presentation in English. Questions in Spanish, very, very welcome. Grew up 200 meters from here, so it's yeah. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to go for English. So what we wanted to do with this part of the presentation is to give you a bit of a taste of how we think about a lot of the results that we're going to be presenting to you, which can sometimes feel a bit abstract in kind of the big message that we have at the IEA. So we want to give you like what's behind the analysis, how do we think about technology transitions, how do we think about decarbonization and so on. So this is as far back as we have data, I would say the reliable data in terms of CO2 emissions globally. Right now we are on top of that mountain. Whether we want to be there or not, that's a different question, but now the challenge is we need to get down from that mountain and to reach a certain level of CO2 emissions that's compatible with what we have right there. 2-degree temperature increase, which we think is what would avoid, or the UNFCCC says, what would avoid dangerous climate change. Now, if we look at the history of the energy sector, again, this is as far back as we have data at the IEA. We collected a lot of different sources. What was the energy mix, the primary energy mix globally? You see, like in the 1800s, it was pretty much biomass, traditional biomass. Then Industrial Revolution came along, and there was coal coming in. Later on, 1880s, we had oil and gas picking up. And then 1960s, we were poised for a new transition, but you see, in terms of oil and gas, but you see it's pretty much remained flat. There's very good reasons for that. And then from there, we need to now implement a new transition that relies a lot more on renewables and nuclear and energy efficiency and so on. And these transitions happen typically 35, 40 years. You can see they're even longer. Those are the typical time frames for these kind of transitions. But now we have to reduce CO2 emissions faster than CO2 emissions have increased in the past 40 years if we want to reach only 2 degrees. So when we think of the IEA, okay, well, how do we actually go about giving recommendations about how to do this? What you see here is that's the global energy mix. This is already giving you the kind of picture in 2050, where you see a lot more green that you would see, greens, renewables, and waste that you would see today. A lot more electricity, that's the light blue that you might see today. But the idea behind this is to show you that at the right-hand side, the right-hand side of the figure, you have all the demand sectors. So you have industry, buildings, and transport, and then other end uses. And on the left-hand side, you have the primary energy sources. And that is going through different transformation processes in refining, in power plants, and then transportation processes in grids, electricity grids, fuel transportation networks, and heat networks, and so on. So what we do is we start from the very right-hand side, and we try to say, okay, well, we want to estimate what is the actual material demand in the future. So how much cement do we need? How much steel do we actually need, given what we think is going to happen to buildings, given what we think is going to happen to roads, and so on. So given the infrastructure needs that we have, the demands in the future, what is the actual material demand that we need? Then we look at other services like space heating, water heating. So we think, given the current economic growth, what's the likely demand for space heating, the likely demand for water heating in the future? We also look at transport, so mobility services. So how much people will actually need to move around in cars? How much will they need to move around in airplanes and so on? What's the mobility demand? And then also, what's the demand for transportation of goods? What's the demand for freight? So we start from energy services. And then we create these models for these 3 main demand sectors that I showed you before, for industry, for buildings, and transport. There are very, very detailed models looking at thousands of different technologies for meeting that demand. And technologies could be things like, a passenger car with diesel of a certain size and so on. Industry the same. We have all these industrial processes modeled there, different ways of making steel, different ways of making cement, and so on. And then finally, from that we get a demand for all the input into these technologies. How much gas do you need? How much oil do you need? How much heat do you need? How much electricity? And we try to find what is the least cost investment trajectory that meets that demand, given some constraints. So, for example, one constraint that we give it is, okay, you can invest in as many power plants you want, but the maximum CO2 that you can emit is this level. For example, a level that's consistent with 2 degrees, with the 2 degrees objective. So we do this for, depending on which sector, 28, 36 regions around the world, and we do it from now to 2060 this year, as Juho pointed out. And as you will see, this has some challenges. In some places, for example, Africa, you see that all of Africa is one region. So there are some things like interconnection within African countries that's difficult to model, but I will show you how we also think about that. So a lot of the terminology that we'll be using in the presentation, I don't know, can you see that? Yeah. So we have the main scenario that we have at the IEA this year. We call it the RTS. If you have come to World Energy Outlook presentations, you might have heard a very similar scenario called the NPS, the New Policy Scenario. And this scenario is not exactly kind of a business as usual scenario, because it already incorporates the idea that we have of, in all these countries, in all these sectors, what are the kind of policies that are likely to happen in the future if things don't change, if the direction that governments are going in don't change. But there's already a continued idea of from now to 2060 there will be certain policies coming online. So this is kind of a reference scenario. that we compare every other low carbon technology, every low carbon policy, every action, we compare it to the reference technology scenario. Then we have the 2-degree scenario, which is the one that every year we have come up with so far, which, as I said, is consistent with a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees. And that's important also to highlight. It doesn't mean that for sure we're going to stay below 2 degrees if we emit that amount of CO2 between now and 2060. It's linked to a probability of 50% chance. And this is from a typical analysis that we do at the IEA, from these long-term scenarios. The share of CO2 reductions, what we call the wedges, which are the shares for all the different big options like efficiency, like renewables, like nuclear, and so on, in all the total CO2 reductions from going from the RTS, from the reference scenario, to the 2DS. And what you see is that efficiency is the most important factor. It's around 40% of all the reductions. You see renewables are the second most important lever that we can push. And then also nuclear and CCS, particularly CCS is a big role. So what we did this year is we wanted to push, well, we had COP happened in November 2015, and one of the messages coming out from COP was that the new agreed objective was going to be well below. So we wanted to find out, okay, what does well below actually mean, and what are the implications of going well below? So we came up with a trajectory. We had a lot of modeling, discussions, and so on. We came up with a trajectory, which is what you see here, we call the beyond 2-degree scenario, which reaches net zero emissions by 2060. And it's kind of the midpoint of the Paris Agreement, which is consistent with 1.75. Now, it looks like going from 2 to 1.75 is not such a big deal, but this is this is where the curve goes like this in terms of costs. It becomes very, very expensive to start decarbonizing after a certain point. And just to give you an idea, many people think, okay, 1.5 degrees, is it possible? Going from 2 to 1.5 means actually the amount of CO2 that you can emit from now to 2060 is half. So you have to cut it by half. And it becomes practically impossible. So this is the kind of scenario we said, okay, if we really push technology to the reasonable limits, that is still technically feasible, that we think is still feasible, this is where we think it could go. And you see here that it's still a lot of efficiency. There's some renewables, but you see the additional effort is not so important. And a lot of that is down to what Juho was already saying, that many renewables are already on track. So the extra effort is not that required. But what is really important there, you will see CCS. And the reason for this is because, as I will show you in a second, in some sectors it's very difficult to reduce CO2 emissions after a certain point. So you can your only option is to capture the emissions and to store them underground. So one of the big messages from the analysis is that the future, no matter what scenario you look at, electricity becomes very important. Already in the past few years, electricity became the fastest growing energy carrier of any fuel energy carrier. Hang on a second, yeah. So no matter whether you look at the RTS, the 2DS, or even the B2DS, the change in actual final electricity demand is not that important actually. So what does happen is that the things that you electrify are different because you go more for low carbon options for electrification, but the technologies themselves are actually, the share itself is not that different. And if we look at sector by sector, which is what you see there on the right hand side, you will see that that's the change in final electricity demand. What you see in the first column is going from the RTS, the reference scenario, to the 2-degree scenario, and then the one on the right is from going from the 2-degree scenario to the well below 2-degree scenario. So you see that in each case the additional effort is more in transport, so there's the increase in electricity demand. A lot of this is electrification of vehicles, but there's also electrification of, to some degree, in trucks, a lot more high-speed rail and so on. And then you see that the demand actually reduces in a lot of the other sectors because efficiency is also very important. I might not go into this detail just in the interest of time. So if we look sector by sector what is happening, in buildings, you see here 2014, measured in exajoules. That's the amount of energy use that happened around the world. 123 exajoules. The number is not so important. In 2060, energy use still increased, but is very, very constrained even in the reference scenario. So we think already a lot of efficiency is built in the current trajectory. But then actually the energy use went down in the well below 2 degree. The important thing, however, is that the share of electricity really increases. And the reason for this is that there are a lot more technologies in buildings that rely on electricity. For example, electrification of heat. There's a lot of heat pumps. In this scenario, there's a lot of thermal comfort options in general, a lot of air conditioning as well. And there's also what we started looking into, which is the Internet of Things. There's a lot of new connected devices that are happening in buildings that are increasing the electricity demand somehow. This electricity demand also means that buildings can become a source of flexibility because you have more things that you can actually tap into from the electricity sector to provide flexibility. And I'll talk about it in a second. And here I want to give you an idea of what it actually would mean in terms of the effort required to get to some of these scenarios. So this is the how many power plants measured in gigawatts per year were added in the last decade on average and in the last year, and you have it also by technology. So you see a lot of fossil. In the last year this changed, as Juho pointed out. More renewables were added in terms of capacity than fossil energy and nuclear combined. And then you also see that over the last year compared to the last decade, a lot more solar PV, a lot more wind added per year. If we look at what needs to happen between 2017 and 2030, so in kind of the first part of the scenario, you already see that there's a huge increase that needs to happen, and the increase needs to happen throughout. But some of the very, very challenging ones that you will see, nuclear is particularly challenging. So every year from now to 2030 needs to reach the record year of nuclear installations that we have had so far. You also see, particularly from 2030 to 2060, that for solar PV in particular, but also for wind, the scaling up of the building of new capacity is huge. And when we look at the scenarios, actually, for solar PV, about a third of all solar PV comes from, depends on what you want to call it, decentralized rooftop PV. So small scale PV generation, not utility scale. So this is just to highlight some of this. Now, compared to the 2DS and to the 2 degree, in this well below scenario, the decarbonization for the power sector needs to happen much more quickly. So in the 2 degree scenario, by 2060, CO2 emissions globally, the intensity in the power sector, so for every unit of electricity generated, how much CO2 is emitted, needs to reach 0 by 2060. And in the well below, this has to happen 2050 already. And after 2050, the emissions have to go negative. And what we mean by negative emissions, these are technologies that burn biomass, and then the CCS is captured and is stored. And this is sequestering, so it's drawing CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is negative emissions. And you see this is extremely emission. On average, globally, CO2 emissions need to be negative by 2060. And the reason for this is because in sectors like industry, for example, there are emissions that you just cannot reduce CO2 from. There's process emissions, for example, from producing cement. And in transportation as well, it's very difficult to decarbonize some transport modes like flight, shipping, trucks, and so on. I'll talk a bit in more detail about that. The options are very expensive, and it often becomes more cost effective to just reduce CO2 emissions in the transport sector, in the power sector, and make them negative, rather than pay for the expensive decarbonization in transport and industry. Technology makes this is something that's particularly controversial, I think, in the scenario. To reach this well below 2 degree, coal needs to be phased out completely by 2035, so unabated coal without CCS. needs to be completely phased out by 2035. And after 2040 or so, even coal with CCS becomes a high carbon technology. So because not everything is captured by the coal CCS plant, and depending on the assumption that we have around 15%, 10-15% is not captured. So that 10-15% of CO2 emissions from these power plants are enough to make them high carbon at that point. Then we have nuclear, which, as I said, is particularly challenging, the extra effort that is required for nuclear. And we have renewables, which really take the lion's share of the emissions reductions. Yeah, that's just pointing out the issues with nuclear. I might skip this one just like time. So how much does this cost actually to get to 2 degrees? So in the power sector, the total investments are 65 trillion. To give you an idea, first of all, the RTS is 40-something trillion, 42, 43 trillion, so the difference is around half, so 50% more that needs to be invested to go from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. Sorry, I'm getting it wrong. It's to go from the RTS, from the reference scenario, to the well below 2 degrees. That's around a 50% increase. The extra effort compared to the 2DS is not that big. It's actually a 6 trillion. The problem is more in some of the decisions that need to be taken. So some of these investments, for example, in the power sector, are to retire coal power plants. So around 1,300 gigawatts of coal power plants need to be retired that are already either built or in the pipeline. They're already planned for construction. Looking at renewables, we really want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to zoom through this very quickly. Looking at renewables, today we have around 23% share of electricity coming from renewables, and the share in this B2DS needs to increase to almost 80%. And if we look, so what you see, the graph that you see in the center, that's really the only one I'd like you to look at. That's kind of filling all the CO2 reductions relative to the reference scenario. So you see that almost all of them are actually coming from renewables. More than half are coming from renewables in the 2DS and in the B2DS. And you see that in terms of investments on the right-hand side, most of the money needs to go into wind, solar, and solar thermal, solar PV and solar thermal. In terms of CCS, you see that the investments actually are compared to renewables are not that huge compared to the RTS, but some of the decisions are controversial. You see that a lot of the money on the right-hand side, you see that it's going to BECCS, which is the biomass plus CCS capture for negative emissions, because it becomes a very expensive option. But as I said, it's cheaper than a lot of the other options for reducing CO2 at some point. And then nuclear, which is another sensitive area for the scenarios, is the nuclear capacity needs to double in the B2DS. And what you see there on the left-hand side is that, in fact, most of the growth, if not all of the growth almost, is coming from countries that are not members of the OECD, so developing, emerging countries. A lot of it is happening in China, as you see there on the right-hand side in terms of investment, but also in India and in developing Asia. Now that was in terms of mostly generation, power generation. This also needs a supportive infrastructure. So it's everything from transmission, distribution, smart grids, storage, and so on. So again, here to give you a bit of a flavor, what does it mean for the infrastructure? What you see there on the left-hand side, that's the idea that I think a Canadian newspaper had in 1959 of what a house with solar might look like. 2014, that's a photo of Australia that I took, and a very different picture. So the question is, what does what does the transformation look like for the power sector in 2060 in the supportive infrastructure? So the first key point is a very common IEA ETP point, not just owned by the IEA, but system integration is essential for a sustainable energy future. So we need to move away from a traditional energy system, I wouldn't even say current because it's already changing, but it's a traditional energy system. That's a one-directional energy delivery philosophy. And we need to move towards one that has much more integration, that is more focused on services rather than energy. Much more cross-sector integration, and as you will see, this is very important in low-carbon scenarios, mostly because of electrification, but because of other reasons as well. A lot more cross-sector integration, linkages between the sectors. That also means linkages between institutions, so not just the infrastructure, but institutions, policies, and so on. In terms of investment, you will see, so we have their generation, T&D. The investments really need to accelerate towards the end of the period, but early on, they need to about double. So over the next 10 years, investment in transmission and distribution, supportive infrastructure needs to double. We looked in the ETP at some of the key areas for where this infrastructure will be changing. So we looked at optimization of distribution grids. We looked at the integration of EVs. We looked at aggregation. We looked at the potential for demand response in each of these sectors, so in industry, in buildings, in businesses. What is the realistic potential for demand response, and how much could you actually push it if you really were to go for these kind of ambitious scenarios? And here, what we see really most of the investment happens most of the increase in the investment happens in distribution grids. So transmission is so important, as I will show, particularly for interconnection, is key. But a lot of the increase is in distribution. And what we look at here is we look at the range of investments in distribution grids, which include also smart grids. So the first point here, when we talk about infrastructure becoming more distributed, batteries is one of the biggest stories. We have cost there. That's a mistake, by the way. That cost should be 2010. But we see a dramatic cost reduction in battery costs. This is very public. It's around 80% between 2010 and today. And right now, we have now a special coming up, which we'll discuss this, that the story seems to be very similar to what was happening with PV around 7 years ago. And a lot of commoditization, much more cost reductions that we expect that will happen. But in terms of where these batteries are going, if you look at the installed battery storage capacity, what you see there in green, that's EV batteries in the 2-degree scenario up to 2016. And then you see in this purple color every other sector combined. So most of the most of the batteries and most of the learning and the cost reductions will come from EV batteries. The same for the 2DS, which is even more ambitious in this sense. But again, EVs, lots of roaming batteries going around. Now, while maybe the impact could be disruptive, it's still a very uncertain area for storage. So we have, today we look at the historical, so all the storage that is not pumped hydro, so every other technology, which includes batteries, also includes things like flywheels, supercapacitors, and so on. Huge growth, mostly down to batteries, particularly lithium-ion batteries. But if we look at how much this is compared to pumped hydro, even compared to what is currently in the pipeline for pumped hydro projects, this is still very small. So at least in the short term, around 10 years, there will be more pumped hydro capacity installed globally than from anything else. After 2030 or so, we expect that the growth from batteries in particular will overshadow the pumped hydro growth. Now the last bit I wanted to point it out here is around smart infrastructure. So I showed all the increase in EV deployment that we have in these scenarios. And we wanted to assess what would be the impact also of deploying EVs in a smarter way, both in terms of where we build the charging infrastructure, but also how we build the charging infrastructure and how we use it. So we wanted to look at smart charging. We also looked at vehicle-to-grid options and how much will it cost relative to the benefits that one might obtain. And we looked at, with smart charging, particularly in a very deep decarbonization scenario like the B2DS, the savings that come from the flexibility that charging vehicles when it's better for the system and not so much for the individual, actually offset the investments in the charging infrastructure itself. So it's just doing in a smart way, the charging would actually pay off for the investment in charging infrastructure. And what you see there on the right, that is the combined potential that we see in these scenarios for demand response, including smart charging, which, as you see, particularly in B2B, is quite significant, around 400 gigawatts in 2060. But there are huge uncertainties in diffusion and scale-up. And we have now a report coming up on digitalization and energy at the IEA. It's being launched in November, which will go into a lot of detail, more than I can cover here, in how we actually deploy this smart infrastructure and what challenges are there. And then finally, also because it's Spain and it's something that we really feature in our scenarios, so we have done a lot of work trying to improve the way that we look at interconnection between regions and between countries. And we look at some key regions where do we see a particular need for investment in interconnection. And what you see here, basically the investment interconnections in the well below 2 degree needs to double compared to what is today. And transmission particularly from interconnection accounts for 40% of all electricity grid investment needs in the 2DS. And yeah, we'll have actually a publication coming up on this in this aspect as well, looking at specific regions, interconnection there, and this is coming from our scenarios. And just to talk a bit about what's happening also in other sectors, in the transport sector. Transport already is experiencing a very deep technological change. This year, for the first time, we started looking at some of the impact on car sharing in transportation, and also on automation in transport. In terms of sales of light-duty vehicles, we tend to have a view different from other organizations, that we think there will be a lot, particularly in these scenarios, of modal shifts. So it's not about selling a lot of cars or maintaining the current way that we go about private transportation, but actually changing that and going to much more modal shifts. So a lot more cycling, avoiding transportation, and so on. And in terms of the stock, there used to be a kind of fuel cell electric competition. For light-duty vehicles, pretty much as you see, it's all battery electric into the future in our scenarios, and plug-in electric as well. However, for heavy-duty transport, no easy routes. So this is this is a photo from our chief economist, who's from Eastern Europe, and he has this view of what a truck looks like. But this is actually an interesting kind of early example of some post-war. And so this is you see that it's connected like a tram on top, un tranvía. So this is a very early trial of what is called, as you know, capillary. I should tell him it's catenary lines, which is a way of overcoming the problem of trucking, of decarbonizing trucks, because the density that you need for trucks, the energy density, without using fuels is very, very difficult. So batteries, Tesla, you might have seen that announced they're going to come up with a truck. We still have to see what that actually looks like. But even if the costs go down in the most aggressive scenario that we have, it's still very difficult to think about fully electric trucking with batteries. So one of the options is to actually have these catenary lines. It's a mature technology, and it could be considered, and it's actually considered in the scenarios, could be realistically implemented. Then there is the option of fuel cells, but still it requires an underlying infrastructure. It's very, very difficult. So the view from the IEA is that this is probably less attractive. And there's also biofuels. And this brings me, hang on, there's a fuel cell vehicle. So this brings me to what's happening to trucks. Zero emission technologies in the 2DS, basically trucks also need to be decarbonized. Some of these emissions one cannot decarbonize. So again, as I mentioned, you have to go to negative emissions in the power sector to compensate. But you see, this is a dramatic transformation for tracking. This only looks at tracking, and there's all these options for fuels, looking at hydrogen electrolysis, for example. So power, it's called power to fuels or power to gas. And and also biomass. There's a lot of biomass. And so the final challenge I will talk about in this scenario is how does one use biomass sustainably? Because it's it's a very high value, low carbon energy source because of the high density and the fact that it's de facto low carbon, zero carbon. So for the well below, we kind of looked at, okay, what's the most aggressive view that you can actually take on biomass without actually going crazy? How far could you actually take the way that we use the land, the technologies that we have for producing biomass? How far could we actually push it? So right now there's around 50 something exajoules being used of biomass globally. You'll see a lot of it is buildings, and this is what we call traditional biomass, which is a lot of cooking, exactly, and it's firewood, it's things that one gathers locally. It's not the modern biomass. In the RTS, we expect, so kind of reference scenario, we expect this will go up to 100 exajoules. As I said, it's not business as usual, but it's a kind of reference scenario. Buildings is reduced, but this is not because it's becoming, it is becoming more efficient, but it's more from fuel switching away from this polluting, cooking with biomass, cook stoves and so on. More efficient cook stove, but also urbanization and moving away from using biomass. And then you see also there's a lot of using power in the reference scenario. In the 2DS, however, you see it doesn't really change much in power, and it's because in the power sector there's other technologies that, like other renewables, that can reduce CO2 emissions, and it's much more valuable to use it in areas where it's very costly to decarbonize otherwise. So in industry, for example, very expensive, or in transportation, as I just mentioned. Between the 2DS and the B2DS, we actually saw that there's not a lot of room for getting more biomass out in a sustainable manner, so without impacting food, without impacting health, and so on. And what changes mostly is how we use the biomass. So in the power sector, as I mentioned, we start using it for negative emissions, and we really prioritize it for sectors like transport and industry, and much less so in buildings, because again, buildings, as I mentioned, a lot of electrification, lots of heat pumps and so on. And I think I'll pass on to Juho for some of the final slides.
Okay. Thank you, Luis. Thanks a lot for that. And yeah, we've been PowerPointing you very efficiently the past about 50 minutes, so this will end very soon. A few points on industry, a few points on CCS, research and development, and a few concluding points. Can we produce materials more sustainably? It's a question really essentially about industrial energy use and its development going forward. I think this is an area where IEA is trying to put more effort into trying to understand how various industrial sectors use energy and what levers can be used to improve. So we currently use in the order of 150 exajoules in a lot of industrial sectors. They are responsible for 8 gigatons or so of CO2 emissions, which is about a quarter of CO2 emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions. And looking at the reference scenario, we think that the energy consumption in industry would increase by roughly 60% by 2060, and emissions grow to maybe 10 gigatons, which at that point would also represent roughly a quarter of the emissions. However, in a B2DS scenario, we would need to very dramatically achieve a shift here and produce more goods and services, more materials with essentially the same energy use that we have today. And that would then beg the question, how can we possibly achieve anything like that? I think 4 levers have been looked at more extensively in this book. We welcome you to have a look more closely. One is the materials efficiency issue, both in the end use. Can we produce the same amount of service with less materials produced? Materials efficiency in the manufacturing itself and further recycling. So can we basically be able to produce various products in the world by using less of these materials? Second area is energy efficiency, by using technology in the manufacturing processes themselves to drive down energy consumption. We're also looking into the issue of feedstock change, and how can we use more renewables in industrial processes, for example, biomass in cement kilns. And fourth big lever in the industrial sectors would then be novel new technologies that are being developed, such as direct reduced iron, oxy-fuel kilns, deploying CCS in various industrial sectors as well. So industrial energy use needs to be dramatically also reduced and tackled in a climate-friendly scenario. Looking then at CCS, where the challenging task is really ahead of us. It's not that CCS will be actually such a huge sector, if you like. There's going to be way more power from renewables, but it is important for those final gigatons of reductions, and due to the fact that we can achieve some negative emissions with CCS. We're currently capturing in the order of 30 million tons per year from 17 projects, but that doesn't even really show when you look at what the deployment challenge would be. Under 2 degrees, we'd need to reach nearly 7 gigatons, so 200 times what we're doing today and more per year, captured from various sources, be it power, but also various industries, and way higher in B2DS. Now, I think on CCS, ramp-up rates from industrial analogues, from natural gas industry, power, suggest that there's experience in building industrial systems according to that 2DS ramp-up rate, more or less. But there is no experience in doing it according to the B2DS ramp-up rate. So the actual capability of being able to build CCS is a challenging point and will require serious incentives. Wedged between a few final points are actually, logically, as you would see, some conclusions from the earlier talk. I think in the beginning we mentioned that early signs do point to the changes in energy technology trajectories, and we can see some success stories from energy policy and technological development, but that progress is at the moment too slow. And Luis, I think, went into length in discussing the integrated system approach, which clearly is needed across all technologies and sectors as well, because they all impact each other in 2DS and in V2DS. And all the same that countries and regions require their own transition pathways, and there's no one single one-size-fits-all solution available. I think many of the slides here and the book itself really shows that the carbon neutrality by 2060 and beyond 2DS type outcome is something that has not been ever done before, and is pretty unprecedented technology and policy challenge. And we're also kind of keen to say that the 2-degree scenario remains the IEA central climate-friendly scenario, and B2DS is our way to look at what the Paris ambitions might be like that is by no means an IEA suggestion that this is exactly the road that governments need to take. That's I think there's lots of other solutions and other decisions that governments and the world community needs to take before these unprecedented challenges are tackled. And innovation clearly is a key area where governments and industry must work together. And finishing on innovation and R&D points after this slide, clean energy R&D spending was in the order of $30 billion in 2012. By 2015, it remained in that very same level. So we've stagnated actually in the past years with the clean energy R&D inputs. By the way, questions on this to Luis, please, because he did all these figures. Now, if we contrast this to what just 3 top IT sector R&D spenders do, well, that's the double, just one year, and that's just the top 3 firms. So the clean energy R&D inputs are clearly not at the level where they ought to be. And potential help could come from this mission innovation organization that was launched back in the Paris COP, where 15, 20 countries pledged that they would double their clean energy R&D inputs. So by doing that, we might reach what just top 3 IT companies are doing. What the IEA can do here, technology collaboration programs or TCPs, is a mechanism whereby we bring various technology groups together to analyze and look into technology development issues. There's 38 of them altogether. Spain participates in 17, so that's a great start, but there's ways to actually get involved in even more of them. And these really encompass virtually the whole globe in terms of the participating countries. And we also now currently host the Clean Energy Ministerial Secretariat, which gives us another way of shaping clean energy policy making by major economies going forward. And that's the end now, finally, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for your patience, and we're happy to take questions and comments from you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Juho and Luis. It's a very complete presentation. I think you cover all of the sides of the technology, all of them. This is the time for question. I think you have presented some hot topics for discussing, and this is something like doubling the nuclear capacity, or increasing a lot the pump storage, or something I read here about the heavy-duty vehicles, or well, whatever. There are many, And the last part, for the people who are involved in R&D, is a very good question. There are just 3 firms. Technology are enough for them. Okay, it's the time for you to ask questions. Introduce yourself and ask the people in English or in Spanish, as Luis said.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Luis Navarro. I come from Memories and Data Group. I would like to ask you about, you talk about CCS, but I'm willing to know a bit more about CCS utilization. So now I know that there's some, European level projects aiming to develop technology in order to transform, CO2 into methanol, let's say synthetic gas. I don't know if you have at least a preliminary idea about the potential impact of these developments. Thank you.
You can answer this?
Yeah.
You are an expert of this. This is technology back to metal.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. First of all, we should say that CO2 to fuels or CO2 utilization or conversion is not in the models. So that you will perhaps have noted, but that's not really considered for various reasons. One being that many of them are, apart from enhanced oil recovery, perhaps rather new areas at the moment, and and we simply haven't been able to develop our modeling to be able to somehow or in any way, have them in the global picture. Yeah, indeed, CO2 to fuels, also using CO2 for plastic manufacture or in some building materials manufacture is kind of increasing as a topic, and we know there's lots of research going on. There are already companies who also offer CO2-based polymer products and things like that in small quantities. I think they can kind of make perfect business sense. For, in a way, climate issues, I think we need to solve a lot of rather large questions on life cycle type analysis. That if you transform CO2 into fuels, what will that replace, and what will its impact be in the wider energy system? And we simply are not far enough to be able to comment really thoroughly on it. For us and CO2 utilization, I think there probably be three questions to answer, at least at this stage. One is what's the fate of the CO2 once you have converted it into something? Does it remain away from the atmosphere, or does it get released very rapidly afterwards? Another one is the scale. That is this some thousands of tons or some hundreds of thousands of tons, or are there users that could be in millions of tons or large scale, in which case it could be perhaps interesting from a climate perspective. And then also perhaps the economic area as well, that what type of price money could be paid for a CO2 producer, if you like, for a ton of CO2 delivered, and is it enough to cover the cost of capture? And if it isn't, is somebody going to pay you a very high sum, or will somebody have to be putting in subsidies or something? So I think you ask a really good question, and we need to look much more into this, especially as regards integration of CO2-based products into the models.
Okay, some more questions. We have two here. Let me give to this guy, and after this, Antonio.
Sí. Quite sorry, Mr. Lipponen, I will make a little remark, not a question,
Okay.
In Spanish. Estamos hablando de un tema crucial que es la transición energética, que puede ser una etapa en la historia del mundo, un suceso global. Pero también podemos ver esto como una revisión de los errores que se cometieron con la revolución industrial. Estamos hablando de tres dimensiones: la dimensión medioambiental, el sistema medioambiental, que tiene su propia lógica, que tiene sus propios desarrollos. Estamos hablando de la necesidad de desarrollar nuevas tecnologías en la industria energética, con lo que implica de un proceso de inversiones a una escala descomunal, como se ha señalado en la mesa. Y estamos también, de alguna manera, minorizando o ignorando los tremendos problemas que esto va a causar a escala social y las tensiones y los conflictos que se van a producir cuando se produce un cambio de esta escala. Entonces, la probabilidad que estos tres subsistemas funcionen de una manera armoniosa es muy pequeña, teniendo en cuenta los problemas de gobernanza que tiene nuestro mundo.
¿Haces alguna pregunta?
Esa era la reflexión que yo quería hacer y poner el énfasis en que todo cambio tecnológico supone graves problemas sociales.
Bueno, veremos todos los estudios que hay económicos, de cómo la industrialización, eso. Let me go to Antonio, no? The micro. Introduce yourself.
Okay, Antonio Hernández, KPMG, thank you very much, and thank you for your very clear presentation. Okay, my question is related to two technologies. One is CSP, concentrated, and the other one is offshore wind. Which is, in your view, the future of these two technologies? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll take both questions. So in terms of CSP, so you'd see like in the graphs we always label STE in our graphs, solar thermal energy. I'd say first in terms of the well below scenario and also the two degree. CSP, particularly after 2025, in our scenarios has a very starts having a very high value because of the storage component. When we do this analysis, we use this kind of hourly or sub-hourly electricity price modeling to look at what actually happens when you start having all these low marginal cost or low short-run cost generation in the system. And then CSP starts to have a very high value for the extra hours that it can generate in the evening, where PV actually, unless you have some form of storage there as well, doesn't have that flexibility. So just the dispatchability and the value that CSP has starts being very interesting. In terms of the cost reductions, we also see PV reducing faster. The learning rate is just faster for PV. A lot of it is down to the fact that PV is a different technology. Everything else is thermal based, and there's some cost reduction potential for the mirrors, for a lot of the infrastructure costs, a lot of the soft costs, the building, the installation, and so on for CSP, and that's mostly what's going on down in the scenarios. But for the technology itself, it just doesn't drop as quickly. So the value is mostly as a kind of the dispatchable low carbon generation, and you really see it pick up in these scenarios. Not so much when you go between the RTS and the reference and the 2DS. It's more at higher decarbonization. And your other technology? Offshore wind.
Sure.
And offshore wind, I mean, it's going really fast right now, almost faster than we can incorporate in this kind of annual analysis. By the time it comes out, it's already, the cost has really gone down quite quickly. For offshore wind, I would encourage you to look at the energy investment report that we came up with this year. Has a special look into offshore wind that we wrote there. What is the kind of outlook for, especially in the short term, for offshore wind, which has really changed very, very quickly. A few years ago, when you looked at the learning rates for the different technologies, the offshore wind was the one that was going up always consistently. And right now, there's a really significant potential. I think around a third of all the wind in the scenarios is offshore.
Okay, some more questions? Well, I have just...
Hi, Laura García from CEPSA.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really like the technological approach. And I have two questions. You mentioned that 1/3 of the new solar PV demand, I don't know in which year and which scenario, can come from decentralized energy. I understood that this is something like the prosumers or somebody that is going to produce the energy for themselves. And I would like to know in which regions are you focusing this kind of consumption, because I don't know if it's something from Africa that is going to be something really different, as they are not going to develop like an infrastructure grid, or is something happening in California, and this is something that I don't think is it possible in Europe. So which is your perspective on this? And the other question is, considering that you are the energy agency, I would like to know, what do you think in a case where we are really ramping up with all the renewable energy and we don't have really massive scale energy storage, how does this agrees with the concept of energy security if we go to a really high levels of renewables?
All right.
You can answer these two questions.
Together, sure.
Please. Pick another one.
Okay. So I'm not sure. Is this? I'm not sure if it's on. Actually, it's on. Down. Up. It's on. Okay. So in terms of the rooftop PV and the prosumers, so actually the fastest growing markets right now is Australia, but also Germany and Italy. In terms of rooftop PV, are the fastest growing markets today. You mentioned Africa. We also do the analysis for this kind of systems. It's very different systems in Africa than you might have in California or in an OECD country. So what you have typically in Africa, which is also in our scenarios, is this kind of very low power systems that are bundled together with very efficient appliances. But you're talking about, well, it really depends on the system, but the 100 watts, 150 watts is really the upper, upper scale. 80 watts is a 20 watt system that's now being sold by a company called Mcopa. So those kind of systems are really very different. So you don't really see in terms of the capacity so much in these countries, but in terms of the penetration, it's really huge. So we estimate if you were to give electricity access to everyone in Africa, which is already what we have in the scenarios, but just to reach that goal, around 40% of all the systems would be solar, decentralized, fully decentralized solar, or small-scale solar, and then an extra 20%, I think, an extra 20% is mini grids that are mostly powered by solar with some diesel. This is what we have in our scenarios. So there's, but those are very different. And then the issue of kind of rooftop PV in an OECD country, we did an estimate here of like how we do it in two ways. Like one is technically how much could you actually do if you were actually to do that. So like rooftops, like measuring like all the rooftops around the world kind of thing, and then also with solar thermal. So you have both technologies competing for this space. And then given the population density and so on. So one is the technical side. So we try to give a limit. You never get to that limit. I mean, we use in this scenario something like 8% of the technical potential for rooftop solar, so that's not the question. And then there's the economic aspect of it, so which is a kind of race between whatever tariffs or whatever tariff structure you're setting up, and then what's the consumer actually trying to maximize their own PV generate, their own self-consumption. And in terms of so we basically, when we do this analysis, we take not so much the economic view, which for the private consumer, which is much more about the kind of policy that you have in place, but we take a kind of least cost, perfect world scenario. Is it cheaper to actually do this, or is it cheaper to do something else, given all the other constraints?
The second question from her is the security of supply with increase the renewables in the grid.
And the grid integration without storage. Yeah, the grid integration without storage. I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that by now that you don't actually need storage to integrate quite high shares of renewables. Early on, you can do a lot of things like optimizing market operations. Just the way that you manage your grid, you can actually increase the hosting capacity a lot. And then as you go to higher penetrations, you have other options. I showed things like demand response is quite effective to implement, and it can be a cheap way of doing it. And then there's other options. Like before you actually get to the point where you absolutely need to invest in storage. So I mean, we have a lot of work.
Something?
Carlos, actually.
Okay, these two guys ask a question here. Yes, both. First, Carlos.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My comment is related to this security supply matter, and when we are facing so huge implementation of renewables, obviously storage should be playing a very relevant role. But what about gas natural also as an additional technology to give this support to the non-predictable capacity of renewables and also storage. Are both storage and gas natural competitors? They are complementary solutions. What do you think about this?
Maybe we can pick another one. Carlos, introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm also Carlos Gasco in this case. I work in Iberdrola, the power utility. I'm sure you're familiar with that. I have actually two questions. One is, in the B2DS scenario, does the system become cheaper because of all the measures that you have actually depicted, basically energy efficiency? Because, you know, with the amount of investment that you require, I have a big question mark regarding what happens to that investment and how does it reflect in costs and eventually in prices. The second question would be about policies and markets. You also describe a landscape driven by electrification. Electrification actually requires massive investment, and we see that some of the robustness in pricing signals is kind of flagging, and I'm not sure that we can actually follow the threshold of investment required, taking into account the rules and regulations and the policies in place that we have, in generally speaking, in the world. So I would like to hear your elaboration on those two things.
Okay, you
Thank
can
you
answer
very much.
these three questions, no? More than two.
So in terms of
Gas or storage, the first, and the other one.
Sorry.
Prices?
The price. So in terms of is it cheaper to answer this one first? Like is it cheaper? It's cheaper to run the system, absolutely. So in terms of the short-term prices, yes, it's very much cheaper. In terms of the total costs, when you combine both investment and operational cost, is more expensive. So there's a question of, I think there's two questions. Like one is who bears the cost? Is a long-term transition. So who bears the cost of this transition if the benefit is going to come later on, both in terms of prices and also in terms of the climate. So you're avoiding some climate things in the future. So that's kind of a very common question. And then there's also the equity question that it doesn't happen in all regions, in all countries equally, the benefits.
Okay, the second one is the security of supply or the role of gas and storage. No?
The second one, absolutely. So we consider the first question, yes. So we consider. I think you're talking about flexibility from gas power plants, not so much the gas network, like residential customers. But absolutely. So we also consider flexibility from gas power plants. Like around the world, we have data on what kind of investments are needed to retrofit existing plants to make them flexible enough for this kind of scenarios, and it takes a very important role for these kind of scenarios that we're talking about here. Not so much, just because gas plus CCS, yes, but the flexibility from gas plus CCS is lower than you get from unabated gas, so it becomes less attractive. Particularly in the B2DS, you might have seen like it's, I think 2050 or something like that, unabated gas becomes completely decarbonized. So we used to say like for 2DS, gas was a transition fuel because of low carbon, but also because of the flexibility. Below 2DS, even coal it's gone. And then the policy.
On supply security, grid issues. One comment that might be of interest. That certainly is a point that we're looking at more and more, and we also have now in the renewable energy division a new unit that's called System Integration of Renewables that looks specifically at the issues. What are the challenges that you have with the higher penetration of renewables, variable renewables, and how do you deal with them? And we also, like in the recent work that we're doing with, for example, countries like India, is it like a pet topic. How do you modernize the power system to be able to deal with significant share of renewable energy going forward? So that's certainly a big topic. I think the policy question is it's a brilliant one. I think if you look at the scenarios, look at reference technology scenario in a way is closest to what we think you might expect with the current policies. So that in a way it's maybe not 100% forecasting, but it's kind of forecasting. Where do current policies take us? And they take us nowhere near where we need to go. We do have in the book, in all the chapters, quite a bit of discussion on what we need to be doing, and I think the basic message is that we cannot rely on this is not a book about a global carbon price. I think it's very much more granular message that you need specific, very strong policy drivers in power, in industry, in buildings, across the board to drive the big transformation. And those policies are probably not even close to being in place today. Or maybe there's some good examples, but they definitely need to at least continue and be boosted going forward. So if the technology transition ambition is high, it needs to be coupled with policy changes, and if they don't happen, then the RTS is perhaps the way where we go.
Okay, the last question that you have, this is the last question for him, and this is 5 minutes left.
My name is Federico de la Hoz. Thank you for staying here. Thank you, Arcadio, to organize this event. Just one question. I say all the decarbonize in the future, there are 3 technologies. They are CCS, thermosolar, and nuclear. You have been talking about CCS. Would you want to give some thoughts about nuclear and about thermosolar and what will be the future of the nuclear?
Good one.
Go ahead.
I can start.
Represented doubling nuclear capacity.
So we had for the below 2 degrees, we had a doubling of nuclear capacity. So a lot of what we have there is, you might have seen that a lot of the growth is happening in non-OECD countries. So this means that there's also kind of technological shift. We have already in the scenarios these small modular reactors that are much smaller in size. They're much easier to build, in theory, and it's much easier to. They don't have a lot of the proliferation issues that you might have with nuclear in some of these countries. So we have a lot of small-scale modular reactors. We have technology improvement as well in kind of a baseline PWRs that we're building around the world. It's quite tricky. I mean, a lot of the capacity you might have seen is happening in China and in India, actually. But there's also other places like developing Asia that the more we look at it, the more it makes sense that there should be an increase in nuclear capacity. And so yeah, I mean, for us, every time we come up with this, it's a controversial topic, but we do see that it makes sense to expand the capacity.
The second one is CSP.
And CSP, we had a question about CSP earlier. Yeah, we do see it in the scenarios. We have, so in the interconnection report that I mentioned as well, we look into a lot of detail on North African CSP, what is the potential there. But we have also a lot of CSP in India, in the northern part of India, in the deserts. In China even we have some CSP. Yeah, and there is quite a significant penetration. I mean, from our side, the value of CSP is more as a complement for a lot of the other renewables rather than one of the kind of 3 key technologies. That's kind of what we see more.
Okay, Juho, do you like something? Okay, thank you for coming, Juho and Luis. It's a pleasure having you here. We gave you an applause. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll see you.